The account of the fallacies as derailments of strategic maneuvering explains why it may, as a matter of course, not be immediately apparent to all concerned that a fallacy has been committed, so that the fallacy may pass unnoticed. In principle, each fallacy has sound counterparts that are manifestations of the same mode of strategic maneuvering, so that it's more difficult to tell them apart than when the distinction involved two completely different types of animals. Like when all the legitimate moves would be cats and all the fallacious moves would be dogs. That would be easy. It is fully in line with what Sally Jackson calls the assumption of reasonableness, that a party that maneuvers strategically will normally be assumed to uphold a commitment to the rules of critical discussion, so that a presumption of reasonableness is conferred on every discussion moves, and this assumption is also operative when the strategic maneuvering that is used is in fact fallacious. Deviations from the rules for critical discussion may be hard to detect because none of the parties will be very keen on portraying themselves as unreasonable. It is to be expected that in order to realize a purpose that is potentially at odds with the objective of a particular discussion rule, rather than resorting to completely different means, they will stick to the usual dialectical means for achieving their objective and stretch, as it were, the use of these means in such a way that they allow the other purpose to be realized as well. Echoing the logical standard definition of a fallacy, we can then say that the strategic maneuvering involved seems to comply with the critical discussion rules, but in fact it does not. Strategic maneuvering only derails into fallaciousness if it goes against the norms for having a reasonable exchange embodied in the rules for critical discussion. This means in practice that the argumentative moves concerned are not in agreement with the relevant criteria for complying with a particular dialectical norm. As we already observed, these criteria are determined by the soundness conditions the argumentative move have to fulfill to remain within the bounds of dialectical reasonableness in the argumentative context in which they are made. And they may vary to some extent according to the argumentative activity type in which they occur. That's why I passed around the idea of activity types. As a case in point to conclude with, trying to avoid the use of technical language as much as possible, I shall briefly discuss the demarcation of non-fallacious and fallacious moves in a particular mode of strategic maneuvering taking place in the rather open argumentative activity type of an informal conversation. The mode of maneuvering I have chosen is defending a standpoint by advancing an argument from authority. The argument scheme used in an argument from authority is a subtype of the argumentation known as symptomatic argumentation, also called sign argumentation. In the argument scheme that argumentation of this type is based on, the acceptability of the premise is presented as a sign that the conclusion is acceptable through the establishment of a relationship of concomitance between the property mentioned in the premise and the property mentioned in the conclusion. Such a symptomatic association is, for instance, suggested in argumentation such as Paul must be a cheese lover because he is Dutch, where it's stipulated that loving cheese goes always together with being Dutch. In the case of an argument from authority, the transition of acceptance is guaranteed by referring in the premise to an external source that has the knowledge or expertise required for drawing the conclusion, so that having expertise is presented as a sign that the expert's assertions are acceptable. Like using other arguments from sign, using arguments from authority is potentially a sound way of strategic maneuvering. In a great many cases, we are fully justified in supporting our claims by referring to an authority that is supposed to know. In argumentative practice, this is in fact often the only sensible thing we can do. If we have good reason to think that the source we are referring to is indeed a good source to rely on in the case concerned, and was to be taken seriously when he made the observation referred to, an appeal to authority can be unproblematic and may even be conclusive. In argumentative practice, however, strategic maneuvering by means of arguments from authority can also derail. An appeal to authority may not be justified in a particular case because one or more of the critical questions that need to be asked to check if the criteria for assessing arguments from authority in the activity type concerned have been fulfilled cannot be answered satisfactorily, so that the argument violates the rule that we call the argument scheme rule, and must be considered an argumentum ad verecundiam. So an appeal to authority that's fallacious we call an argumentum ad verecundiam. In different argumentative activity types, different criteria may apply for complying with the soundness norm incorporated in the argument from authority variant of the argument scheme rule. In the informal activity type of a conversational exchange we took as our context for illustration, it is in principle up to the participants to decide what the conditions are for sound strategic maneuvering by arguments from authority. In the case that we are dealing only with agreement, in this case we are dealing only with agreement or disagreement between the parties about the conditions for sound strategic maneuvering by arguments from authority. In some particular argumentative activity types, such self-created agreement may be a sufficient condition. When I claim, for instance, in an exchange during a game of Scrabble, that the word I have just laid out is an English word, because it's in the Oxford Advanced Dictionary, this is a perfectly legitimate move if you and I have agreed earlier that the dictionary will be our criterion for Englishness. In other argumentative activity types, however, the relevant agreements will be predetermined institutionally. Then other conditions may have to be satisfied. In a scientific discussion, for instance, the scientific community, also called a forum, determines what sources count as authoritative and what further conditions apply to making an appeal to such a source. It's not hard to imagine that still other conditions for sound strategic maneuvering apply to arguments from authority in other argumentative activity types, such as a parliamentary debate or an editorial in a newspaper, or to other modes of strategic maneuvering, such as assigning the burden of proof or pointing out an inconsistency in the other party's position, carried out in any of these argumentative activity types, so that in different argumentative contexts, different criteria may apply for complying with the rules for critical discussion. This brings argumentation theory back to the context of situated argumentative discourse, and this is exactly the context in which both Toulmin and Perelman wanted argumentation to be studied. Thank you very much.